In this video, you're going to learn how to build this in Bubble. This is a custom Stripe subscription manager, one that allows users to look at their invoice history, can change their plans, they can upgrade, downgrade, cancel, and they can also swap out their payment method. So if you're looking for a more customized solution for user subscription management, this is the walkthrough for you. We're going to break it all down. We'll look at the database structure, the actual API connection to Stripe itself, and of course the front-end UI designs. We're going to get started now with a quick overview of our demo page and the various components you'll need to have ready to build out your billing manager. In our demo design here, we've organized everything into different sections to make it really easy for the user to manage all things related to their subscription plan. You can, of course, design this a little differently if you want. If you prefer to put things into tabs, that's completely up to you. So our first section here is for the upcoming invoice. This is some information that Stripe calculates for you, so you don't have to do all of that math, but it's very helpful if you have different subscription plans to let the user know what the next invoice is going to be for the next billing cycle, because if the user makes any changes to their plans in the current cycle, there are going to be adjustments made to calculate how much they owe or have already paid for based on the time used or unused. You can actually see that this demo user here has made a change, and therefore some calculations are happening, and the next invoice is going to be billed a different amount from their regular recurring amount. Okay, so this is very helpful information to give the user a heads up. This is not an invoice that has already been issued or charged in any way. The next section here is a history of issued invoices in the past. So these are paid invoices. This demo user currently has just one paid invoice, but at the next billing cycle, there would be a second item that shows in this table. Okay, this is a list of invoices here. We're also giving them the ability to download that invoice. So I'm going to click on this button here. It's going to download a PDF version of the Stripe invoice. I'm going to save this to my computer, and I will open this up so you can see what it looks like. Just like that. That way they can see it, or they can print it off if they want. Okay. Then we have our payment method section. So every subscription is going to have at least one payment method attached to it. This could be a credit card, a bank account. It's up to you, which types of sources you want to allow. But the user also has the ability to add another payment source. Now we've got this hooked up specifically for credit cards and a couple other options I'll show you here in just a second that you configure from your Stripe account. But they can also change which method is going to be a default method if they have multiples. Of course, they can also remove them if they want to do that. So I'm going to click on this button here so you can see what this looks like. This is the only function that takes the user away from the Bubble application so that they can add their payment information securely on a Stripe hosted page. Remember that Bubble is not PCI compliant, so you don't want to save any credit card numbers in full to your Bubble database. So at the moment, I'm actually seeing three different options here: card, Cash App Pay, and US bank account. These have been enabled within my own Stripe account, so you actually have many more options. Stripe has connections with many other sources that you can connect to and actually enable here in this list. I do encourage you to look at that if you want to give your customers or your users different choices. Credit card is going to be, one of the most common, but all they're doing here is providing that information to save it to their customer record within Stripe so that it can then be used as a payment source for the subscription. Nothing's actually getting charged here. Okay, I'm going to go back to our billing page in our Bubble app. All right, now the next section below that is updating the subscription plan. So if you do have a tier system, you can have a design similar to this where they can upgrade, downgrade. You can have other information about what the plans contain, sort of a comparison chart. Again, that's more up to you, what you want to display to your users. But all of these functions are going to be triggered directly from the app. And of course, we have the ability to cancel the subscription so that they can end it, and you can have logic behind the scenes to change any other records in your database that you need. We're accomplishing all of this by communicating with Stripe's API in a custom way. When you communicate with the API, you're making requests to either receive information, such as a list of invoices, or make something happen on the Stripe end, such as adding a new payment method. Okay. The first thing you'll want to do is open up the API reference for Stripe. You can find this at docs.stripe.com/API. This is a good idea to bookmark this site. So this is something you're going to reference when you're configuring your API calls. It really details absolutely everything, what's required, what optional settings you have available to you, and it also has a lot of definitions around things. There are many different resources that you can communicate with the Stripe API, and we'll be going through through a handful here for all of the functionality that we have in our demo page. The next thing you'll want to do is go over to your editor for your app and then go to the plugin section and install, if you don't have it already, the API connector plugin. This is a free plugin published by Bubble, and it's your primary tool for configuring all of your API requests with your specific customizations to fit your app. Okay, so getting started with the API connector, first thing you'll want to do is click on this button here to add this block for your new API connection, right? If I wanted to connect with another API, I can click on this again, and I have a second block here, collapse it down. All right, I'm going to remove this for now and open up my existing Stripe connection. So the top part of this form is mostly about the authentication settings, and then down below you can add your various calls. We have several here to support the demo features, and I'll be stepping through each of these so you know how to customize them. Okay, so for now what you can do is you can give your API connection an internal name. This is just for you to identify it, so Stripe or Stripe Custom, something like that. Set your authentication to private key in header. Set the key name to the word authorization. Make sure there aren't any extra spaces here. And then for private key, you actually have two fields here. Stripe is very much like Bubble, where there are two separate environments, one for test and one for live. So if you go over to your Stripe dashboard, head over to the developers menu here, and then go to API keys. Within this section, you'll see Stripe will generate for you a secret key and a publishable key. For the API connector, you're only going to need the secret key, and that key starts with SK underscore, and then depending on the environment you're in, it'll say live or it'll say test. So in my dashboard, we can see I'm currently in test mode. So when I go to that API keys area in my test mode, I'm going to see my test secret key. Okay, and so I've copied that and pasted that here. The value is going to be the word bearer and then a space after that word, and then the key that you've generated from your Stripe account. When you are ready to move over to the live environment and work with real credit cards, real transactions, make sure that you switch over to the live environment of your Stripe account, go over to the API keys section as well, and then you can paste in your live secret key here. Again, make sure that there's a space in between that key and the word bearer. All right, and then go ahead and also add a shared header for all of the calls. You can click on this button here. It'll add this pair of inputs. The key is going to be content-type, and then the value is going to be this string right here, the word application /x-www-form URL encoded. Okay, so all this is it's telling Stripe the format of our API requests, and Bubble is going to handle a lot of that technical formatting behind the scenes for you. What we'll really be doing is filling out these little mini forms with the required values we need to perform our operation. Okay, so again, we'll get into these individually in more detail very soon here in this video. Now the last thing here for just general setup is the database structure. I'm going to take you through how we've organized our data types and fields to save specific IDs and relationships of things to our app here. You may have some slight differences depending on what else is going on in your app. And also note that what we're picking up on here is really managing a subscription that already exists. Okay, so you will need to have in place the mechanism for subscribing for the first time and capturing the user's subscription ID and customer ID to your database, right? So here's how we've organized where these things get saved. Under the user data type, we have a text field for the customer ID. Okay, we also have a text field for the default payment method ID. So it's just one payment method, not the list of payment methods. We have a relationship to a separate data type called subscription. And then we also have an option set to tie to the user here for the user status. So the choices are active and inactive. Okay, if I go to option set, user status, active, inactive. Those are my two custom choices. And I also have another option set for the subscription status. Okay, so subscription can be trialing, active, canceled, or pending cancellation. In other words, it will cancel at the period end, but we are still within that last period. So this is really just a flag to let us know that the user has canceled, but they're still allowed to access it until the end of the current billing cycle. Right? So back to our data types, let's go over to the subscription data type here. We've created this to organize all details about a specific subscription. So the fields we have here, we have a date field. If the user cancels their subscription, we're going to capture when they canceled. And then we have a separate date field for that final period end date. So this is the actual cancellation date. Okay, so for example, the user could be canceling 2 weeks before their end period, so there will be a 2 week difference here, just for informational purposes, and it can help with some of the logic as well. We also have a relationship between the subscription and another data type called plan. Plan is where we organize all of our options for the plan. So if I go to my front end here, right, basic, pro, enterprise. This is not unique to user. It's just the options that I'm offering my users to subscribe to. So every subscription is unique to a user. As you can see here, we're relating it to the user, and it helps us understand which plan they are currently subscribed to. If they're going to change the plan, then the value of this will also change. Okay, here's our status for the subscription. Again, it can be either one of these choices. And then we also have a text field for the Stripe ID of the subscription. If you go over to your Stripe dashboard, let me go over to the subscriptions list here. Okay, so I have 2 active subscriptions. If I open one up, I can see that this has a specific ID. Okay, I can also access it up here. I can also access it here. It's the same thing. Same thing for customers. Customers, I have a bunch of customers in my sample data set here. If I open this up, it's going to show me the customer profile, and I can also get to that ID on the right-hand side as well. Okay, so these IDs are generated by Stripe. We're not creating them, but whenever a new subscription is created, you'll have access to those IDs, and you'll want to save them somewhere in your database that makes sense so that you can retrieve them for all of the API calls later. Right. So then under our plan data type, we have very simple three fields here: the amount for the plan, the name of the plan, and then the ID for the plan as well. This will help with changing plans if the user is upgrading, downgrading, things like that. Let's now look at creating API calls to retrieve data and also set up actions in our workflows. We're going to start with looking at the API call to receive all of the invoices. This is going to be our most basic call. We're going to start easy, and then we'll work our way up to more complex calls. So all we're trying to do is pull a list of specific invoices for this subscription and customer combination here. Okay, so the first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to go over to the Stripe API reference, and I'm going to navigate to the Invoices resource. You can search for it here. I'm going to go to Invoices under the billing category. Okay, you can also, of course, scroll up and down on the menu here. Within this Invoices category, I have many different calls that I can make to work with invoices. I can create an invoice, retrieve a list, retrieve a single one, make updates. I can search through them, right? A lot of different things here. All we're going to be working with is this call right here, list all invoices. And we can filter the list of invoices by a specific customer. All we need to provide is a customer ID. And that's why it's important to save those IDs to your database so we can dynamically insert those values. We're actually also going to be filtering on the subscription with the subscription ID as well. Again, if the customer has multiple subscriptions, this helps us narrow things down even more. So the reference here is going to tell us exactly what we need to make a call properly. We have our possible parameters, and these are all optional. You'll notice anything that is required. Let me go over to a different one here. You'll see an actual note in here from Stripe that tells us if something is required. But all of these are optional. We're going to be using customer and subscription. And I want you to note on the upper right-hand side here a few things. We have the method of the API call. This is a get method. There's 5 methods that you can select from, and we'll be seeing an example of a few of them. And then you also want to look at the endpoint for this call. So this URL right here is known as the endpoint. You can think of an endpoint as sort of an address for where that resource lives and where you're going to send your request. Okay, so in our editor under the API connector, I'm going to scroll down to our API call that I've created here for retrieving invoices. So again, when you're just getting started, you'll click on this button to add a new call, and you can collapse them down like that. Okay, so I'm going to go to the one that I've already created for getting invoices and open this up. And there are a few things here that we're going to set up. So the first is just the name. This is internal. It's just for you so that you can identify it. I recommend you name it as literally as possible so it describes exactly what the call is for, right? So I'm going to get invoices. That's how I've named it. And we're going to be using this as a data source. So we're going to keep this selected here in the dropdown. The only other option is as a workflow action. But again, for invoices, all we're doing here in our design is we're populating our table of invoices. So it's going to be a data source. So you can see here type of content, get invoices data, our data source is Stripe, get invoices data. These will only become options once you've successfully set up your API call, which we haven't done quite yet, okay? Or I haven't walked you through that part yet. So use as data, you can leave the data type as is here on the JSON setting. And then here is the method selection. So we saw in the API reference, we want to use the get call. Okay, so you have a few others to choose from. Get is typically for retrieving, post is typically for creating, put and patch are a bit interchangeable, but again, look at your reference, look at your documentation. These are more about making updates, and then delete is gonna delete data. So here you'll paste in the endpoint URL. Okay, make sure there aren't any spaces or anything. And then down below you can add your parameters. So you'll click on this button and you'll get, these different fields here to set up as many parameters as you need. The keys for the parameters need to match exactly as you see them in the API reference. So customer, subscription, right? No numbers, no spaces, nothing funky, just exactly how you see it there in the API reference, you'll paste it in. Be mindful of extra spaces. And then for the values, what we're going to do in order to initialize this for the first time and complete the setup is we need to grab an actual customer ID and subscription ID from our Stripe account. Okay, remember, we're still in the test environment, but you do need to have some data in here in order to initialize your calls. So for example, if I go to subscriptions, I can create a test subscription right from this dashboard. And once I do, I'm going to open one of these up here. I'll have access to the subscription IDs. Same thing for customers. So make sure that you have at least one record in the Stripe account so that you have some ID to run off of. Now, for this particular call, you will want to make sure that the subscription ID is a subscription created for this customer, because if you insert a pairing where they're not actually linked, you're going to receive an error. It's going to say something like, there is no subscription with that ID for this customer. So make sure that you actually create clean, accurate data in your test environment. Okay, so you'll paste those in there. Make sure you uncheck the private checkbox. I'll explain where this comes into play in a moment. And then I do recommend you check this box here for allow blank. I'll also explain where that comes into play once we look at it in the design. Now, once you have your values in, you're going to click on the initialize call button. So I'm going to click on it now. And a successful response looks like this. We've just made an API request to Stripe. Stripe received that request and then sent back a response because, we're authenticated properly, everything's looking good, and it's giving us the list of invoice data. So notice my call was named get invoices, and Stripe gave me a list of information under a parameter value here called data, or a parameter key called data. And so our data source is this list right here, get invoices data. That's just the name of it. So when you set up a repeating group or a table, you're typically looking at the name of your custom data types or possibly a custom state, things like that. Here, in our case, it's going to be get invoices data. So this is all of the information, all the fields that we have access to now for one invoice at a time. If you wanted to look at the full response, so the actual list, I'm going to scroll down to the bottom here, you can click on show raw data, and you'll actually see the entire list for the parameters that you specified there. The only other thing I want you to note here are these drop downs on the right hand side for the formats of the field values. Bubble does a really good job of automatically detecting the format of all of the values, but there are some cases where it can get it wrong. So if there are specific fields that you'll be working with, just double check that it has identified it properly. One type of value that you generally do need to change is anything that's a date. So creation dates coming from Stripe are going to come in a Unix format, and Bubble tends to pick those up as text or numbers. So make sure that you switch that over to date Unix so that you can actually work with that field as a date. Okay, and once you're ready to go here, you can click on save. It'll close the pop-up, and now you've successfully initialized your call and you can use it in your designs here. So going over to the table, I'm going to clear out everything here so you can see how I set it up from scratch. I'm just going to select something random so we can change it. Okay, so for the type of content, you can search again by the name of the call. So I'm going to do get invoices, and you'll see it comes up under the plugin types category here. Again, these will only show up once you've successfully initialized. Notice that there's actually a few different options here because the response that Stripe sends back has some of the data sets organized into sub lists of things. So what we're looking for here is get invoices data. Okay, now the data source you're going to access from get data from an external API. And then again, you're going to search for your provider. So this is my call here, Stripe get invoices. And then we have those two parameters that we've exposed to make dynamic. All right, so when you check the private checkbox, you will not see those important fields that you need to insert dynamic values for. They're hidden. All right, so that's what the private checkbox here is referring to. Now, if I uncheck them again, then I will see those parameters show up. And then for the allow blank option, if I deselect those, then it's going to automatically populate those fields with the values that were in the API connector. I usually like to enable this so that it clears those values so that I don't run into any conflicts with some sample values being inserted here. Okay, so now we do need to populate this with a dynamic expression so that no matter who's logged in, we're inserting the right values so that we can show them their invoices and nobody else's. So here's where we reference our database fields. So the customer ID is under the user's customer ID, right? The current user's customer ID. And then the subscription we can find through the user's related subscriptions Stripe ID. Okay, so now we have the right values there for this particular person's subscription. Now notice that right now still the expression is in red, and that's because I'm not matching the type of content. Remember, there were kind of several sets of data there. This is just taking me to the top level. I need to navigate to the data field within that API response, right? You have some metadata, some other details here. We want to go to data. And now we're compatible. We can see that this evaluates to a list of our invoice data. And that's exactly what the table is looking for. Now, once you're inside of your table cells, you can reference the current rows, get invoice data's field, right? These are all of the fields that Stripe sent back to us. Remember from that pop-up, we had all of that information. This is not information that's in our database. This is not in our data structure. These are API fields from our requests that we initialized in the API connector. Okay, and you can see here that created field, because I identified it as a Unix date, I can actually work with it as a date, such as custom formatting, or I can do date math with it, things like that. So once you're hooked up, now you can design your tables however you want to display all the information you want. With invoices specifically, there is a field. I'm going to go to the workflow here for this download button. This is triggering an open external website action. There's a field here within that rows data that says that's called Invoice PDF, and that's the direct link to the PDF file that the user can save to their device. If you run this in an open external website, it'll trigger an automatic download, and that way they can print it off if they want, or they just save it to their computer. Now we're going to look at pulling in the details of an upcoming invoice. It's going to be very similar to the history of invoices, but we're actually going to be working with a list of items, invoice items, to list out the individual rows that we see here in this table, and also have that kind of total amount due. So if we go to our reference, just like we did before, we're going to go to retrieve an upcoming invoice. Okay, we can see that this is still a get call, and then here is our endpoint, very similar to before, but now we have a /upcoming at the end of this. Remember, it's a different address for every call, and we also have a customer and subscription parameter options for us so that we can filter things down to retrieve a specific upcoming invoice for this combo here. So going over to our API connector and then heading over to our call for upcoming invoice, you can see it's a get call. There's the endpoint still as a data source, and I have the exact same parameters here. Again, you initialize it so that you can retrieve that information, and I want to show you, the data structure here is a little bit different from the list of invoices from before. Okay, so I'm going to scroll down until we see a sort of nested point, right? We have lines here. So notice the name of the data source here, upcoming invoice lines data. This is going to be the data source of our table that we have in our design here. Each one of these items is a different line within the parent invoice, okay? And so that way you can reference things like a line ID or the individual amount, the individual description, things like that. So again, hit save once you've initialized. So in the design, here's what I've done, because I do need to reference sort of both levels, the parent invoice for the upcoming preview as well as the individual lines. So at the group level, I retrieved the upcoming invoice. Okay, so this is again my data source from Stripe. I'll do this one more time here. Get data from external API, and then I went to the Stripe upcoming invoice, and here's where I inserted those parameters: current users customer ID, and then current users related subscriptions Stripe ID. Okay, and that's where I've left the data source. I did not navigate to anything within this. Right? I do have access to the lines, but I'm not accessing the list here at this group level. I'm on a parent group, which is only going to accept one item as its data source. Okay, and type of content, again, is one single upcoming invoice. Within this group, I have my table, and the data source here is going to be the parent group's upcoming invoice, which is that group that I just set up. And then I'm navigating to that lines field, that list field of individual line data. Okay, again, because the table is looking for a list of information. And then the type of content is going to match that exact data type, right? The upcoming invoice lines data. That's what we see here. Okay, so be very mindful, be very careful with your types of content so you know where you are in the hierarchy of information. So at the group level, I have a text that is going to display the parent group's upcoming invoices next payment attempt formatted as a date, so I actually know when the billing cycle will start. Also at the bottom here, I have the amount due, right? The group upcoming invoice, or I can also reference parent group. I'm talking about the same element. Upcoming invoices amount due. Stripe will send you amounts in terms of cents, and so I'm dividing it by 100 so that I can display it as a dollar amount. But that way I have that total, right? That's the invoices amount due. But within the lines here, within the rows of my, if it's a repeating group or a table, it will work both ways no matter which element you're using there for the list. I can display individual line information. So the current rows, lines data description, the current rows, line data quantity, unit price, again, dividing it by 100 because everything with the amounts are in terms of cents, and then the individual lines amount. Okay, and so we get this design right here. Okay, be very mindful of your data sources. Hey, real quick, if you're finding this helpful, take a look at our free extended workshop over at coachingnocodeapps.com/workshop, where we'll guide you through our 4-phased approach for going from idea to app. So if you're looking for a complete start to finish guide, this is the workshop for you. We've got a lot of great stuff in there for you. So I've got the link on the screen right now and in the description below. All right, so now that we've seen what it takes to communicate with Stripe and pull in data to display in our custom designs, now we're going to take an action that occurs on the Stripe end. We're going to look at switching out payment methods. This is definitely something you want to offer. It's really common, over time users will need to update their payment methods. So let's jump in now to see how to incorporate this functionality. All right, so for payment methods, we're working with 4 different API functions actually. So we're going to create a new payment method when we click on this button. We're going to change the default method, and we can remove the method as well. And we need a way to list all of the payment methods for a specific customer, okay? So these are the endpoints that we'll be working with. If we go to the API reference here, within payment methods, we'll be looking at update a payment method. This is to change the default. We're going to look at detaching a payment method to remove. We'll also look at listing all of the customer's payment methods for the table. And I have in a separate window here, creating a checkout session. This is to create a new payment method. Now, technically there is a separate create payment method function here, but this involves passing in the full credit card details and bank account numbers directly from a design in your app. We're not going to take that approach. What we're going to do instead is create what's called a checkout session to navigate the user away from the app temporarily to a hosted checkout page. It's fully designed by Stripe, where the user can more securely enter in all of their details. Stripe will remember that and send the user back to the app. Okay, so we're going to take this approach. It's a lot faster to implement and easier to secure. All right, so in our API connector, I have those 4 calls here: retrieving cards, adding a new method, updating, and detaching. So let's start with adding a new payment method. This is our checkout session call. Notice that this is an action now, because when the user clicks on that add card button, we're going to trigger our API call here so that we can then navigate the user away to that checkout page. Okay, this is a post call. Again, this is information that you can find here in the reference, right? There's the method, here's the endpoint that we have in the field here. Now we have 4 parameters for creating a checkout session, which is kind of bare minimum. You do want to look at the reference and see what other options are available to you if you want to customize things further. The first one here is the mode. There are 3 modes that a checkout session can work within. Let's go to the reference here, and I'm going to scroll down to, let's go to the create. We're going to scroll down to the mode here. So payment, setup, and subscription. We are going to be using the setup mode, and this is simply to save payment details. Payment mode is for creating a checkout for a one-time payment, so the user will actually be charged in that moment. And subscription mode is to create a new subscription and also be charged in that moment for the start of the subscription. So in our API connector, we have setup here. This is a value that's not going to be changed because I know that with our implementation and our design, the only reason the user is going to trigger this is to add a new payment method. They're not going to be charged. So I'm going to leave this on private. I don't need to swap it out for some dynamic value. The customer parameter is again going to be the customer's ID, so I know which customer to associate this payment method with. The success URL allows me to specify where I want Stripe to send the user to once they're done with the checkout page. Okay, and then we have a currency here, which is a required parameter. I do need to provide that, so I have USD there. That's also not going to change, so I've kept the private checkbox checked. So again, reference your API documentation here so that you know what exactly is required, what options are available to you to customize things further. Also note for the post calls, you do want to set the query string checkboxes to enabled here. This is also part of the formatting behind the scenes. Okay, so now in the workflow, when the user clicks on the button, it's going to run that call. You can find this under plugins here, and then here are all of the custom action API calls. So there's my add payment method, and then I'll fill in those two dynamic values. I have my customer ID, and then for the success URL, I have the basically taking the user back to the page that we're on right now, the billing page. So I'll have the base domain of my app, website home URL. This is nice dynamic expression because it will take care of the branch that you're currently working with, whether it's one of your development branches or the live branch. You don't have to swap those out. And then I have the page name, billing, and then I have a parameter here. So question mark session equals success. I've just made up this key and value pair, but I did create a parameter so that I can respond to that when the user comes back from the checkout page. That's what this workflow here is for. This is a pages loaded workflow, and this is only going to run if we see that the session parameter in the URL not only exists, but the value is the word success, because that's how I configured it over here. The instruction that I gave Stripe to send the user back to. So you can create that expression here by doing get data from page URL, and then you'll have your parameter key. In my case, it was the word session, just like that. And then I'm looking for if the value of this key is the word success, just like that. Okay, and if that condition passes, then it's going to show a little alert message to let the user know that everything was successful there. Okay, so once that action has run, it's going to create a checkout session, and part of that checkout session is a URL that I can navigate my user to. So that's what step 2 is for. I'm going to open an external website, and I'm going to go to the result of step 1. That's my new checkout sessions URL. There's a lot of information here about the checkout session in general, but all we care about right now is that URL. All right, so I'm going to run through this so you can see what this looks like in real time for the user. I'm going to click on add card. At this point, it's just created the checkout session, and it's navigated me. We haven't added the payment method yet. You can actually see a reference to the unique checkout session here. I'm going to add a new credit card, and I do encourage you to check out Stripe's testing page, docs.stripe.com/testing. Here's where there's a section here where you can access a number of test credit cards. So I'm going to do one that I know doesn't exist for this particular user. We'll do this Diners Club one. Okay, I'm going to copy that number, and then I'm going to paste it here. We'll do a date in the future, 3-digit number, Jane Doe, and a zip code like that. And I'm going to save the card. So it's just saving the information. It's not charging the user. And once it's done, Stripe is going to send me back to that success URL specifically. You see that alert message there. I'm going to close. This is from my browser extension. But you notice that there's the parameter in it, and that's why that alert message showed. Okay, now if I scroll down to my table, you can see that Diners card is now added to my list here. So now let's take a look at the data source to display all of the payment methods that have been attached to the user. So going over to our API connector, okay, the get cards call that I have here, this is a data source similar to how we did with the invoice table. This is a get call, and here is our endpoint. So if you go to the reference, we are working with this call right here, list a customer's payment methods. So get call, here's our endpoint. Now this endpoint's a little bit different from what we've seen. This one actually contains a dynamic value in the middle of the endpoint. We have a customer ID there, and that needs to be swapped out for every customer. So the way that you indicate that in the API connector is you have an ID surrounded by brackets. This ID that you have here can be whatever you want it to be. This is internal to you, but do make it something that makes it easy to identify, okay? Because once you do something like that with brackets around it, that tells Bubble that this is going to be a dynamic value, and it will generate another pair of these inputs here for you. Okay, so it'll automatically fill in the key based on whatever you wrote here. And here's where you insert your sample value for initializing the call. And this does need to be made not private so that you can swap it out when you're using it in the data source. Okay, so let's go over to the table design for our payment methods. Here I have get cards data, right? And then here is that customer ID, that dynamic value that's technically a part of the endpoint. And I do have a filter here. This is going to be related to detaching. We'll touch on that in just a moment. But notice also that the type of content is matching our data source. It is the get cards data. Okay, and then inside you can display whatever information you need from that, that source. So this is the current rows, get cards data, card last four. You know, that's one of the pieces of information there. You have a lot of other details that you can display. Now let's look at changing the default payment method for the user. So if we go over to edit this workflow, I'm going to filter things by my payment method functions here. I have two actions. The first is to run an update payment method call, and the second is to update the ID of the payment method on the user data type. Remember, we have that text field here to store that. The only reason I'm saving this here is so that I can have this design to show the user which one is the default. So if I go to that text over here, okay, this is a button that is going to display default, but I have conditions that will change it to, you know, a check mark with the icon there if the current row's ID is the same as the current user's default payment method. If it's not, it's going to change the styling here to, you know, swap out the icon, change the label, just like that. And then also, you know, once it's hovered, it's also going to change the color there. So that's more of a interaction design. Okay. So that is the second step of our workflow here, is to save that ID. So if we take a look at our update payment method call here, okay, so this is a post call, again, another action. According to the API reference, here is our endpoint. There's another example of a dynamic value as a part of the endpoint. So this is the customer ID. And for this particular one, we do need to update the customer's invoice settings, which is related to subscriptions, right? Subscription invoices, to update the default payment method. Okay, and so here we're going to insert the new payment method, because the purpose of this call is to change which existing payment method is considered the default. And I'm going to go over to the API reference. As I talk, I'm realizing that we're actually not using the update payment method call. We're actually making a modification on the customer. The endpoint actually tipped me off here because of the resource that we're looking at. So let's go over to update a customer, right? So we're referencing a specific customer in the endpoint, and then scrolling down to some of these lesser used parameters, but you know, the one that we want specifically here is within the invoice settings of the customer. So it's actually not unique to a specific subscription. It is unique to a customer. And if I unravel this, kind of go into the subfields within invoice settings, I can see here is the default payment method. So this is really the thing that we're changing with this API call. We're modifying the invoice settings, and more specifically, the default payment method within that invoice settings parameter. So you see how I have those two fields within their own brackets? That's how you work with things when you have sort of nested parameters. Invoice settings is the first, and then we have default payment method as the second. Okay, right. So again, if I run this on the front end, let's say I want to change the diner's card to the default, click on this here, it's going to make that change, and my conditions kick in to show me that, okay, now the ID of this row is matching the customer's default payment method ID. All right, now let's look at removing. So removing is going to involve detaching a payment method. Okay, so I'm going to follow the workflow here for this button. Again, we have two actions here. The second action is really to help us have an instant visual response for the user. So when I detach a payment method, this first step is the API call to tell Stripe, hey, we no longer want to remember this payment method. The second step is going to, for the Bubble application, to keep track of payment methods that we've removed. The user could go in here and do a big cleanup and remove a whole bunch of payment methods. So this is actually a custom state. Okay, it's a list custom state that I have on my primary group. Let's go over to the group main here. Okay, so my custom state is called detach payment methods. This is a list of text because it will ultimately, it would be a list of payment method IDs. So whenever I click on that button, we run the Stripe call for things to happen on the Stripe end, and then I'm going to update this custom state to add this new ID to the list of IDs that I've detached. Okay, I'm taking the group mains detached PMs, that's the list of detached payment method IDs, plus the result of step one's ID. So it's the latest one that I've detached. If I'm only removing one payment method, this is just going to be a list of one. But again, if I'm going through a cleanup and deleting a whole bunch, this is going to keep track of all of them. And so what this custom state lets me do is filter my table. So I have my full list of cards, but I'm filtering out anything that has been detached. ID isn't in the custom state list. This is simply because the API call has already run on the customers. Okay, so we're filtering out anything that's been detached. Now, when I refresh the page, it will automatically remove it, but we don't want the user to have to refresh the page. It would be a bit inconvenient. They wouldn't know to do that, and it would seem like the function was broken for them. So if I go here and remove the Discover card, it removes it immediately because of that custom state filtering it out. All right, and if I refresh the page, I also see that the Discover card is gone because technically from the API's perspective, Stripe knows to not send that as a card anymore for the customer. So going over to our API connector and checking out our call here for detach payment method, we can see that this is our payment method resource. Again, we're providing a dynamic payment method ID, and then we're going to detach it. So very similar to the previous calls there. There aren't any other parameters that we're going to run. So the only dynamic thing here is just the rows ID that we want to make our default. All right, we're going to kick things up a notch just a bit here in order to work with changing user subscription plans. So whenever a user wants to upgrade, downgrade, or even cancel their plan altogether, we need to involve webhooks. This is a notification system between apps. So Stripe will send information to your application through backend workflows. This way, everything is synced everywhere. Okay, don't worry, I'm going to walk you through it step by step so that you can implement this into your app confidently. In our design here, we have a repeating group that displays the 3 plan options the user can subscribe to. They'll click on a button to change which plan they want to subscribe to, and this is going to make some updates on both the Stripe end as well as our internal data records. Remember, within our subscription data type, we have a relationship to a plan. So if they change the plan, then the value here changes within the user subscription. And the plan is just our apps offerings, the basic, pro, enterprise, whatever it is. It has an amount, it has a name, and it has its own ID. Now, the thing to know with Stripe's subscription structure is that you have the parent subscription here, right? So this has a subscription ID, it's tied to a customer, things like that. And a subscription has a list of items within it. Every subscription is going to have at least one item, but you can also have multiple items. Okay, so subscription item is a separate entity as well. If we look at our example subscription here, Jane Doe is subscribed to our SaaS application product. This is the name of the product. More specifically, Jane Doe is subscribed to the $9.99 a year pricing plan for that product. And this subscription to this plan generates this unique subscription item ID. Let's say that Jane also wants to pay on an annual basis for extra file upload storage. So that would be a second item that the application can offer on a different, with a different amount. But both items together creates Jane's overall subscription package. Okay, again, most of the time you're just going to have one subscription item within a parent subscription. I want you to note the IDs here. The parent subscription starts with SUB, whereas the item starts with SI. I'm calling this out because you do need to be, you are going to work with these separate values when you're making these changes. So you need to make sure that you're addressing the right thing. Okay, so in our design here, when the user clicks on change, right, either they're upgrading or downgrading, they click on that button that's in the repeating group, we're going to do a few things. The first thing is we're going to first retrieve the subscription overall. Okay, so this is just a call to get the user subscription. Okay, it's a get call. We have the subscription ID that we know, we save that to the customer, and that will give us a bunch of information about the subscription in general. The reason we're doing that is because we need to get the subscription item ID that we want to update. Now, you can choose to save the item ID directly to the user as well. That's completely up to you. And if you know that you have a list of items that can be a part of a subscription, you probably do want to save those to make it a lot easier for you, okay? So I'm retrieving the subscription so that I can also retrieve the item ID. That way I can run my change action, because what I'm changing is not the subscription, but rather I'm changing the item. I'm changing which plan I want the item to be associated with. Okay, I'm updating this resource here. So the change subscription plan call, let's go over to that call here. Notice the resource. This is subscription items and then / an item ID. And so that's why in my step 2, I'm referencing the result of step 1, and I'm going to the first item's ID, right? The first line item within the subscription. And then the only body parameter that I have here is the price. Okay, so you can find this when you're looking at subscription items and we're looking to update the subscription item. We are working with the price parameter. So we just need to provide the ID of the price we're changing to. All right, so you'll put in that value there to initialize, and in the workflow, I'm referencing the parent group's plans Stripe ID, the parent group referencing the parent container that holds the button. That is referencing one of my plan records, and that's going to have a Stripe ID with it. So if I want to, downgrade from Enterprise to Pro, I'm clicking on the button within the Pro cell, and it will insert the Pro's price ID to update our item. And so now Stripe knows that we are subscribing to Pro instead of Enterprise. Okay, and then as a final step 3, we're also going to update our internal record for the subscription to change the related plan value to whatever we're moving to. Now that change will trigger a bunch of things on the Stripe end that you don't have to worry about, such as making any modifications for the upcoming invoice. This is all handled by Stripe. Now, to cancel the subscription, when the user clicks on this button, we're going to show a pop-up. It will display the end of the current billing cycle, so they know how long they'll still have access, because we're not going to formally cancel until the end of the current billing cycle because they've already paid for it. If they click on Keep My Subscription Active, it's just going to hide the pop-up. And the way that we're displaying this date right here is that we're referencing our upcoming invoice group from earlier and displaying that same next payment attempt, because it's going to be the same date. It's the end of the current billing cycle. Now, when the user clicks on Cancel My Subscription, a few things are going to happen here. Step 1 is to tell Stripe that we want to cancel at the end of the period. So if we go over to the API call here, for cancel subscription, this is a subscription resource request. This is a post call workflow action, of course, and we're going to insert this subscription ID. And we need to specify here as a parameter, cancel at period end is true. We are telling Stripe specifically that we want to keep it active until the end of the period. Okay, this is not something that we're going to change. It's just by every time we run this function, that's what's going to happen. So in the workflow, all we need to provide in the action here is just the subscription ID that we're canceling. So the user's related subscriptions Stripe ID. The second action is to modify a few things on the subscription record itself, in our applications database. So the cancel on date is the current date and time. Remember, this is to timestamp when the user chose to cancel. Then the status is going to change to our cancels at period end. This is to help us understand that we're pending cancellation. It's going to be canceled soon. And then the final period end date is the result of step 1. This is the subscription record. current period end, because we know that that is when the final cancellation status will change to canceled from active, and that way we have a record of it in our database as well. And we're also going to just make sure that we're only running this just as a protection mechanism here. As long as the result of step 1, which is referencing the subscription, cancel at period end is yes. This is a field here that Stripe gives us, cancel at period end, that is a yes or no field. So when you're retrieving the subscription or modifying the subscription, you can tell whether it's pending cancellation based on this field. So if this is yes, then we know that our step 1 did exactly what we told it to do, because we have that parameter defined here. Right? This is technically an update that we're making to the subscription. Okay, and the update is to modify this field, and that tells Stripe to not run another charge at the next billing cycle, right? Because there will not be any other billing cycles from here. And then we can hide the pop-up to let the user know, just a visual cue that it went through. We can also show an alert message if we want. Now, what we don't have in place yet, and I want to do this in real time here, is to use a webhook to also update the user's status from active to inactive when the Stripe subscription has finally canceled. So that's going to happen at some point in the future. The user may not even be on the page, and technically they're still currently active until the end of that billing cycle. So we want this to be a server-side operation that happens automatically as soon as Stripe has officially marked it as canceled. So in the backend workflow, I'm going to create a new endpoint API workflow here. So if you think about what we're doing here, it's, we've been making requests to Stripe this whole time. And now what we're setting up is the ability for Stripe to send information to us. So we have to set up our own endpoint now. So we're going to give this a name. I'm going to call this Stripe canceled, like this. This is going to be a public endpoint because we need Stripe to access it. I'm also going to say that it can be run without authentication because Stripe is not a user, it can't log in. And we're going to change this parameter definition to detect request data. Okay, I'm going to click on detect data. It's going to show me this sort of temporary URL for this particular endpoint. I only say it's temporary because it has the word initialize at the end, and that is only going to be used when we're initializing this whole setup here. Normally, it's going to be the full URL that you see here without the word initialize. Okay, so I'm going to copy this for now. We're going to go over to our Stripe dashboard. We're going to go to the developers menu and then to webhooks. All right, and I'm going to add a new destination. Okay, and I'm going to add a new event here. I'm going to search for the event called, let's search for subscription, and we're going to do subscription deleted, right? This occurs whenever a customer's subscription ends. There are many events that you can respond to whenever something happens in Stripe. So we want to respond specifically to this one here, customer subscription deleted. Okay, so I'm going to continue. And I am going to add a new webhook endpoint, going to hit continue, and I'm going to paste in that URL that Bubble was showing me with the word initialize there. Okay, I'm going to click on create destination. Now, in order to complete the initialization for this webhook, I do need to manually cancel a subscription so that it can trigger the webhook event and send information to Bubble. Bubble is currently in a listening state. You do have to have this window open when you trigger this test here so that Bubble can receive the information and remember the data structure, and then we can complete the whole setup process. Okay, so have this open just like this in another window. Okay, I'm going to go back to my subscriptions here. This is Lucy's subscription, and I'm going to cancel, and I'm going to select immediately because I'm trying to simulate the moment that the subscription actually is canceled. All right, so I'll click on this button here, cancel subscription. We can see that it's now canceled. Going back to the Bubble page, you can see that that listening pop-up changed to this pop-up here with all the information. It looks very similar to when you run an API call from the API connector. Okay, so you note that the object ID here has a reference to the subscription ID for the subscription that was canceled. We have a lot of other information as well. I'm going to click on save, and now that it's been initialized, I can actually make changes to my database to stay synced with what Stripe has for the subscription. So the first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to make a change to my Bubble app subscription record. Okay, so we're going to make a change to a thing. We're going to search for subscriptions. We're going to find the subscription based on the ID. So Stripe ID field equals We'll go to request data. This is referencing the incoming data from the webhook. These are all of the fields that come from the webhook. I'm going to go to the object ID. That's the subscription ID. Be very careful not to choose the first ID field. That's just referencing a webhook ID. Okay, so object ID. This helps us find the subscription that we want. I'll go to the first item here, okay? And then I'm going to change the status. Status is now going to equal canceled. Because remember, up until this point, before Stripe officially marks it as canceled, it's still going to be on cancels at period end. Okay, so we're now finally changing it to canceled. And then I can make a change to the user. So we'll say make a change to a thing. We'll refer to the previous step, so the found subscription, and go to the related user. We don't have to do another search because we have everything we need once we find the subscription record. So I'm making a change to the user, and I'm going to change their status to inactive. Right? So again, the webhook is triggered as soon as Stripe finally marks the subscription as fully canceled. This will be a real-time notification, and in that same instant, Bubble will then be able to change the subscription status to canceled and the user status to inactive. And now back on our billing page, we can do a workflow like this to keep inactive users out. I can say do when condition is true. Okay, just once is fine here, and we can say only when the current user's status is inactive. Okay, so as soon as Bubble detects this, we're going to redirect them. We're going to kick them out, send them somewhere else where inactive users can go to, right? We want to remove them from any pages that are only restricted to active users. Now, once you have successfully initialized your webhook, make sure that you go back to the webhook settings and modify that endpoint that you created. So I'm going to edit destination here and remove the word initialize, remove it, because this is the actual address going forward from here. The word initialize is only when you have Bubble in that listening state to complete the setup of the webhook. So I'm going to save the destination here, and that is the final URL there. Now, of course, when you're in the live environment with your Stripe dashboard, make sure that you come in here and add the webhook URL as well, but without version test in it. Okay, because you do have two separate environments. You want to make sure that these events go to the right environment of your Bubble app too. Now the final piece here is just in the design. We have conditions on these two groups here. The user is only going to see one of them. If the status is not cancels at period end, then it will show this group so they can upgrade, downgrade, because this implies that it is active or trialing. If it's already canceled, the user will be inactive at that point, so they're not even allowed on this page. And then this group down below will show if it is cancel at period end. Okay, technically the user is still active. It's just waiting until the end of the billing cycle, but it's going to let them know that they have canceled their subscription. We've got our dates displaying there and letting them know that they have access to the app until the end of the period. They can't make any other changes from here. Of course, if you want to change the flow a little bit about how your users move through cancellations, you certainly can, but it's important to be aware of these different components, especially of working with webhooks so that you can trigger things at the right time. So I'm currently running as Jane, and I already ran through the cancellation process here, and I'm going to show you what happened within our design. First thing is the upcoming invoice changed a little bit. There was previously a third line. There was a higher amount due, and now that third item went away because that was just a charge for the next billing cycle. Since she's canceled, that's not needed, so this amount went down a little bit. And at the very end here, we have the design for just the cancellation message as opposed to seeing all the different plans to change to. All right, there you have it. I hope this helped get you started with a custom billing management system in your app. And if it did, take a look at the content on the next screen. It's going to help you take things even further.